Edward, the last boy king of the Tudor dynasty, died on a suffocating July evening in the year 1553, and the moment his tired eyes closed, England stepped into a nightmare that stretched far beyond his short life. For most people, death is an ending. For Edward, it was a beginning and not a peaceful one. His corpse became a political battleground, a religious weapon, a curiosity for the morbid, and a victim of repeated desecration for more than 3 centuries. Even in death, the boy could not escape the chaos of the crown. His final weeks were pure horror. Edward vomited green, yellow, black, and finally blood-streaked sludge. His head and feet swelled grotesquely. His hair was shaved from his skull. His skin clung to bone. Day after day, he lay flat on his back, staring upward like someone who already knew he wouldn't see another sunrise. When the 15-year-old king muttered, "I am done for," there was no doubt left. His body was already collapsing from within, most likely from tuberculosis, though whispers of poison rolled through every hallway in the palace like smoke. But the truly disturbing part wasn't how he died. It was everything that happened after. His corpse sat unburied for more than a month. It lay in Greenwich, wrapped in cerecloth and sealed inside a lead coffin that trapped the sour rot of decomposition. No funeral, no ritual, no closure. Mary, his Catholic half-sister, had just survived an attempt to keep her from the throne by placing Lady Jane Grey above her. Now she had to deal with the unpleasant problem of bearing the brother who had tried to erase her from the succession, and who died as the first fully Protestant king of England. If Mary honored his Protestant faith, she would betray her own. If she buried him as a Catholic, she risked rebellion. So the corpse waited and rotted. Eventually, his coffin was moved to Whitehall and placed in a massive funeral procession toward Westminster. Crowds wailed, soldiers marched, banners fluttered, and a wax effigy of Edward complete with crown, armor, and the garter lay on a golden bier as if mocking the fragile boy whose body was already collapsing beneath the cloth. Mary refused to attend. She hid behind the walls of the tower and paid for Catholic masses on the side, whispering prayers for a soul she believed was damned. Meanwhile, inside Westminster Abbey, the funeral was held in English, led by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who Mary would later burn alive. Edward was lowered into a narrow vault beside his grandparents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. No monument, no statue, no marker, nothing that told the world a king rested beneath their feet. But the grave did not stay closed. During the Puritan rampages of the 1700s, the ornate Catholic altar over his tomb, crafted by the Italian master Pietro Torrigiano decades earlier, was smashed apart. Stones were ripped out, marble panels vanished, and someone opened Edward's grave. We know because fragments of that destroyed altar were found inside his tomb later, tossed in like rubble. And that was only the first violation. 2 centuries later, in the reign of Queen Victoria, the tomb was opened again. The Victorians were hunting for the missing body of James I and wanted to inspect every vault they could reach. When they lifted Edward's stone slab, they found the lead coffin crushed, torn, and corroded just as you'd expect from a grave that had already been disturbed before. Inside, the cerecloth had slipped away from the head, leaving the boy king's skull completely exposed. No hair, no remnants of hair. Just a hollow, delicate skull lying inches below the floor where tourists now walk every day. A lead plate, rolled and unsoldered, lay at the foot of the coffin, its inscription naming Edward as Supreme Head of the Church of England and Ireland under Christ. A political statement, buried with a teenage king like a manifesto. The Victorians resealed the grave, polished the stones, added a misleading floor plaque a few feet away, and walked off as if nothing had happened. Today, millions of visitors stand just yards from the real tomb without realizing the king is buried not under the plaque, but under the modern altar, pressed into a shallow vault so small no second coffin could ever fit. A child who lost his mother 12 days after birth, A young king whose body decayed before he died. A corpse abandoned, argued over, moved, opened, examined, and exposed. A burial place disturbed so many times it became its own haunted history. Edward's life was short, his death was long, and his afterlife has never truly ended. Edward lay at the edge of life long before death finally claimed him. And when we slip back into those final weeks, the air grows thicker, slower, colder, as if the world itself were preparing to dim the lights around a boy who should have been planning hunts and lessons and childish mischief instead of listening to the sound of his own lungs drowning him from the inside. In the stillness of late spring, when the sun should have warmed the stone walls of Greenwich Palace, Edward's chambers felt like a sealed crypt. The windows were latched shut to keep out the wind that chilled his fragile body. The tapestries hung heavy and unmoving, and the shadows pooled in the corners as if waiting for a signal that the end was near. Servants walked quietly, doctors whispered, and courtiers traded glances that said more than words ever could, because no one wanted to admit that the last Tudor son was slipping into darkness one breath at a time. The sickness began like any other bout of weakness, just a lingering cough, just a tired morning, but soon his body betrayed him in ways too vivid to ignore. Every day his strength thinned, his skin paled, and the light in his eyes dimmed like a candle wearing down to its last inch of wax. The phlegm he coughed up changed colors day by day, first pale, then green, then yellow, then dark as pitch, until finally streaks of red marked each ragged breath. Those who witnessed it pretended not to flinch, but the truth is they feared touching him, feared being near him, feared even hearing the sound he made at night when he could not sleep without being propped with pillows and soaked cloths to ease his burning head. People often imagine kings surrounded by luxury and grandeur, but nothing about those nights felt regal. They felt like watching a child suffer without being able to save him, and the helplessness gnawed at everyone who entered that room. When his physicians insisted on shaving his head to place poultices against the swelling, Edward did not protest. He simply sat there as clumps of hair fell away, as if he had already surrendered to a fate he had known was coming since the first drop of blackened mucus stained his bedsheets. His skull looked too thin, too delicate, almost translucent beneath the candlelight flickering against the walls. Sometimes the glow caught a sheen of sweat across his brow and made him appear ghost-like, a figure barely tethered to his own declining body. Yet even in this state, he tried to show strength, greeting visitors with a weak smile, assuring them he was improving, though anyone who looked at him closely could see the bones pressing through his skin. There were rare moments when he attempted to rise, insisting on walking a few steps or sitting near the window, but these attempts left him trembling and breathless, clutching at the air as though it might anchor him to the world he was rapidly losing. The palace staff tried to pretend that each failed attempt at standing was simply a temporary setback, but whispers drifted through the corridors like drifting ash. The palace could feel the approaching end. Every priest who passed through the gates, every hurried conversation between ministers, every messenger galloping in or out carried the same unspoken message: the king was dying, and with him the fragile balance of England trembled. Edward himself sensed the nearness of death in small, subtle ways. Food no longer held taste, water felt heavy on his tongue, and sleep came in thin, trembling threads that snapped the moment he coughed. His dreams, when they came, were filled with distorted sounds, bells ringing far away, footsteps echoing without bodies attached, whispers that didn't belong to any living courtier. He sometimes woke with his eyes wide, staring at nothing, struggling to remember whether he was awake or trapped in another fever vision. The palace attendants, watching from the dark edges of his room, felt chills as his breath rattled against his ribs, because in that moment he looked like someone who had begun to drift beyond the reach of ordinary suffering. Outside his chambers, England continued on, but even the city seemed to move as though muffled by the boy's imminent departure. Decisions waited, rumors spread. Supporters of Lady Jane Grey gathered like nervous shadows. Mary's allies held their breath. The kingdom felt suspended in a slow, unsteady balance. And through it all, Edward's decline formed the heavy center of the storm. His body swelled painfully, especially in his legs and head, and with each passing day the swelling worsened until the sheets pressed against his skin left faint dents that slowly filled in, like waterlogged flesh on the edge of collapse. Those who lifted him or shifted him said nothing, though their eyes betrayed the terror they felt as they saw how fragile his limbs had become. Sometimes, late at night, Edward asked to be carried to a window where he could look out at the river. The moonlight softened the sharp planes of his face, making him appear younger, almost peaceful, though the breath that rattled through him said otherwise. He gazed at the Thames as if it were some distant world he was no longer a part of, one he could observe but not join. He asked little and spoke less as the days passed. A king's mind should have been filled with matters of state, but at 15, facing the end, his thoughts shrank down to the simplest things: whether the morning would come, whether his pain would worsen, whether he would breathe another full breath without fearing that his lungs were filled with broken glass. His final appearance before the public became a grim tableau whispered throughout court. They placed him near a window so the crowds outside could see he was still alive. But when he leaned forward, his skin clung too tightly to the bones of his cheeks, and the weight of the crown that once defined him seemed replaced by the heavy shadow of death sitting just behind him. People gasped quietly, some wept. They said he looked doomed, but even that word felt too gentle. He looked emptied, as if life had already begun withdrawing from him in slow dissolving threads. When the end approached, it came not with ceremony but with the soft, uneven breaths of a child surrendering to exhaustion. His body burned with fever, then chilled, then burned again until all sensation blurred. By the time the final evening arrived and the sun dipped beyond the horizon, Edward barely recognized the faces surrounding him. A faint tremor passed through him, one last shiver of breath, and then the room fell into a silence so heavy that even the candles seemed to bow in submission. No thunder, no divine sign, just stillness as the boy slipped from the world, leaving behind a kingdom unprepared for the vacuum his death would unleash. In the hours after he died, attendants covered mirrors, closed drapes, washed his thin frame, and wrapped him in the first layers of the cloth that would hold him in place for months. But nothing they did could hide the truth: the corpse was fragile, the skin beginning to discolor, the limbs stiffening in unnatural angles. Even in death he appeared small, as if the weight of sickness had shrunk him, leaving only an outline of the promise he once carried as the son destined to reform a nation. When they sealed him in the lead coffin, the metal echoed faintly like a dull bell, and no one in the room spoke. They all felt an unspoken certainty that this was not the last time his coffin would be touched, opened, or disturbed. Something about Edward's final days carried the scent of unfinished business, of rest that would be denied again and again, of a presence that would linger in the cracks of England's history like a shadow refusing to fade. And as the lid closed, pressing the boy into total darkness, the first chapter of his long, troubled afterlife quietly began, leaving behind a silence that echoed through the cold halls of the palace and promised that the story was far from over. The palace did not breathe easily after Edward's death. Instead, it seemed to recoil, as if the very walls understood that something fragile had been broken and no one knew how to put the pieces back. The corridors filled with muffled footsteps, hurried whispers, and the metallic scrape of keys turning in locks as chambers were sealed. Opened, sealed again, small rituals of control performed by people who suddenly realized that the kingdom had slipped into a dangerous limbo. Outside, the city stirred with rumors, the kind that moved faster than official proclamations ever could, and within hours the entire realm felt an invisible shudder ripple beneath it, the tremor that comes when a throne has been emptied before anyone is ready to name its new occupant. Mary, the king's half-sister and the most senior heir by law, was far from the palace when the news finally reached her. She had lived for years under the threat of being removed, disowned, or worse, and now the moment she had both feared and anticipated had arrived. Yet even as she began her cautious journey toward London, her supporters warned her that the shadow of Jane Grey hovered close, the girl some powerful men had chosen to elevate as the true Protestant successor. Edward's death did not simply extinguish the life of a young king, it ignited an immediate struggle, and the boy's body cold, still, wrapped hastily in cerecloth became the center of the kingdom's most volatile secret. While Mary moved, while Jane's protectors plotted, while courtiers exchanged oaths and threats with equal fervor, Edward lay untouched in his chamber, slowly beginning to stiffen, as if the kingdom's delay in burying him seeped into the pores of his corpse. His attendants washed him with the mechanical precision of people who had done it too many times for too many royals. But this time, everything felt wrong. They tried to close his eyes, but the lids would not stay shut, as though some unseen tension refused to let him rest. They secured his jaw, combed what remained of his hair, and tightened the wrappings around his limbs to keep the swelling from distorting the shape of his body. Yet the fabric still bulged in uneven places where fluid had gathered. The room smelled faintly of herbs and vinegar, but beneath that was the unmistakable scent of a body beginning to yield to decay, a scent that made the attendants swallow tightly and work faster as the hours pressed on. And still no funeral was arranged. No prayers were scheduled. No procession announced. The silence around the corpse became oppressive. Each day that passed without a burial stretched the boundary between respect and neglect. It was as though Edward hovered between the living and the dead, denied the rituals that would firmly place him in one realm or the other. His young body, trapped inside a palace, wrestling with its own political fear, lay in a limbo more unsettling than any ghost story whispered by servants after dark. When Mary finally secured her claim and stepped into her new role as queen, the atmosphere inside the palace shifted with a sudden, forceful gravity. Her arrival did not bring peace. It brought tension that crackled like dry branches underfoot. She demanded reports, questioned everyone, and paced with a fierce purpose that made courtiers straighten their backs. But when discussions turned to her brother's funeral, the room grew cold. Mary's face tightened. Her eyes darkened with a conflict that seemed to tear her in two directions at once. She was a devout Catholic. Edward had died a devoted Protestant. To bury him with Catholic rites would be a triumph for her conscience, but a provocation for a restless country. To bury him in the Protestant manner would be a betrayal of everything she believed and everything she intended to restore. The decision weighed on her like a stone pressing into her ribs. Meanwhile, Edward waited, sealed in a temporary shell of cloth and oils, but still dangerously exposed. The lead coffin had not yet arrived. The carpenters preparing the outer wooden casing worked slowly, uncertain whether the chamber should conform to Catholic or Protestant traditions. Every tool stroke echoed through the hall like a reminder that the boy was still above ground. And as days passed, the smell grew sharper. The room where he lay was aired cautiously, windows opened for brief moments, then shut again when the stench drifted too boldly into neighboring spaces. Guards stood outside the door, but they avoided looking directly into the chamber, as if afraid the sight of the king would follow them into their dreams. The kingdom outside felt the pressure of the delay as well. Churches hesitated to ring bells or hold vigils until instructions came. Foreign ambassadors sent letters filled with confusion and predictions of unrest. Ordinary citizens wondered aloud why their young king had not yet been placed into the earth. Whispers began to rise, suggesting that the silence around his burial meant something sinister, something hidden, something shameful. And in a way, they were right. The shame was not in Edward himself, but in the division tearing England from within. A division so deep that even deciding how to lay a teenage boy to rest required negotiations, threats, and diplomatic fingers pressed to temples. Only after weeks of hesitation did Mary finally agree to a Protestant service, a concession that tasted bitter on her tongue. She declared she would not attend. She insisted on Catholic prayers offered privately in the tower. She refused to let her presence lend legitimacy to the rites she despised. Yet she could not risk inflaming the public by forcing her will upon a kingdom still reeling from years of upheaval. Her compromise satisfied no one completely, but it was enough to move the dead king from his chamber toward his final journey. The preparation for his procession began quietly at first. Seamstresses stitched banners, heralds polished armor, and stonemasons examined the vault where he would lie. The lead coffin finally arrived, its surface dull and heavy, a container built not for beauty, but for sealing away the odor and fluid of a decomposing body. When they lifted Edward from the table and lowered him into the coffin, the sound of his weight settling inside was soft but unmistakable, a muffled thud that vibrated through the hands of the men holding the edges. They arranged the cerecloth around him, checked the seals, and began closing the coffin with slow, hesitant movements, as if sealing away not just a king, but the last remnants of a hope England had briefly carried. When the lid finally shut, the room exhaled. For the first time since his death, Edward was hidden from sight, concealed in metal and wood. The attendants stepped back, their task completed, but the silence remained heavy, as though the air still carried the echo of Edward's final breath. And outside, preparations for the grand procession continued with mechanical inevitability. Horses harnessed, musicians assembled, and heralds memorizing the order in which they would ride. Yet beneath every detail pulsed an uncomfortable truth: this funeral, delayed and debated, was not born of unity but of necessity, a ritual held together by fragile political thread instead of shared mourning. The night before the procession, lanterns glowed along the palace corridors as servants moved through dim hallways, adjusting draperies, clearing pathways, and placing torches where the morning light would not reach. The atmosphere felt restless, haunted by the weight of all that had been left unsaid. Some swore they heard distant coughing echoing through the wing where Edward had once slept. Others claimed the candles flickered unnaturally when passing near the coffin. Maybe it was imagination, maybe exhaustion, but no one lingered near the room longer than necessary. When dawn finally came, pale and muted through the mist, the palace stirred with the reluctant grace of a body rising before it is ready. Edward's coffin was carried to the prepared chariot, draped in layers of black and gold, and the moment it left the palace walls, the air changed, as though the building itself was relieved to release him. But the journey ahead was long, and the crowds lining the path would soon see the image of a life cut short being pulled through the streets of London, each clattering hoof against stone marking the beginning of a new chapter in a story that refused to rest. And so Edward began his slow departure from the world of the living, not yet buried, not yet forgotten, drawn toward an abbey that would become both his sanctuary and his prison, a place where his body would lie but never fully sleep. The procession that carried Edward from Whitehall toward Westminster moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a kingdom trying to convince itself that order still existed, even when every face in the crowd knew how fragile that illusion truly was. The morning mist clung to the streets like a second skin, softening the outlines of buildings, smudging the colors of banners, and muffling the sound of muffled weeping that floated between clusters of onlookers. People pressed forward not to celebrate a fallen ruler, nor to mourn in any collective unity, but to witness history shift beneath their feet, because they understood in some unspoken way that the boy in the coffin did not merely represent the end of a life. He represented the end of a direction the kingdom had hoped to follow, and the uncertain, trembling path that now stretched ahead under the new queen's shadow. The air held a chill that did not come from the weather, but from the collective realization that the future had arrived abruptly, without waiting for the living to prepare themselves. The horses that pulled the chariot were draped in black velvet, heavy enough to drag against the ground, and their breath steamed pale clouds that drifted upward and disappeared as though swallowed by the thick air. Guards on horseback rode alongside with their faces set in rigid expression, but their eyes betrayed exhaustion, fear, or sorrow, depending on who looked closely. The heralds held high the banners stitched for this day, symbols of lineage, power, and the tidal pull of history, yet the cloth sagged slightly under the weight of dew and something more intangible, something like grief or dread. Behind the chariot walked servants, courtiers, and nobles in ranks that stretched far behind, each step measured carefully, each movement controlled, because no one wanted to make a misstep that would tarnish the fragile dignity of the moment. The effigy that lay atop the chariot, a wax likeness of Edward dressed in royal garments, drew gasps as it passed. Crafted with unsettling accuracy, it showed a healthy, dignified king, not the wasted boy whose body lay inside the coffin beneath. The golden crown, the jeweled collar, the sword set with glittering stones, all these details painted a portrait of power that Edward had worn only briefly in life, but would now carry through death. Some in the crowd bowed deeply as the effigy passed. Others whispered prayers, and a few crossed themselves with trembling hands, unsure whether they were sending a child home or saying goodbye to the vision of reform and transformation that his reign had promised. The contrast between this regal facade and the truth hidden within the lead coffin created an eerie tension that hovered around the procession like fog refusing to lift. As the chariot rolled slowly along the road, the city reacted in waves. Some windows shut tight, their occupants unwilling to watch. Others opened wide with families leaning outward, straining to catch a glimpse of the passing cortege. Children were lifted onto shoulders so they could see above the crowd. Mothers held crying infants close. Old men whispered comparisons to previous funerals they had witnessed. For many, this was not mere spectacle, but a moment they would describe to their grandchildren. A moment that would be retold in hushed voices for years because of the strange, heavy energy that clung to the air, like the echo of an omen. It felt as though the city itself held its breath, waiting for the chariot to pass so it could exhale the fear that had accumulated since the king's final illness overtook him. Inside the abbey, preparations had been underway long before the procession set out. Candles flickered in the dim interior, their flames swaying gently under drafts that crept through ancient stone arches. Clergy in robes moved silently across the floor, their footsteps softened by carpets and centuries of footsteps before them. The space had been arranged with solemn precision, a raised platform draped in cloth of deep black, banners aligned along the walls in careful symmetry, and the Book of Common Prayer prepared for the ceremony that would unfold despite the Queen's absence. The air inside smelled faintly of incense and cold stone, a combination that lent the space a sense of somber timelessness. Even the statues that lined the walls seemed to watch with heavy marble sorrow. When the chariot arrived at the abbey steps, the gathered clergy and nobles shifted forward. The moment the coffin was lifted from its wheeled platform, silence fell so completely that even the wind seemed to hesitate outside. The men who carried the coffin braced themselves against its weight. Lead was heavy, not just in its physical form, but in the symbolism of sealing away the decaying body of a king. They took each step with deliberate care as they climbed the steps, and those watching felt their own hearts lift and fall with every soft thud of boot against stone. It was a moment neither triumphant nor tragic, but suspended between both, as though the kingdom itself were uncertain of how to feel. Inside the abbey, the service began with a low hum of voices rising in measured cadence, the English words reverberating against the stone in defiance of the Queen's Catholic leanings. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who stood at the center of the ritual, spoke with a clarity that carried across the great hall, though beneath his steady tone lingered the knowledge that he himself would soon face the Queen's wrath. His presence at Edward's funeral was both a tribute and a target, a mark of Protestant defiance held aloft in the heart of a country bracing for religious reversal. The congregation stood stiffly, some murmuring prayers under their breath, others staring blankly ahead, wondering how long the fragile peace would last. A communion was offered, though those in attendance whispered that it was conducted poorly, with trembling hands and uncertain movements from those tasked with delivering the sacrament. Whether from fear of offending the new queen or from grief for the dead king, no one could quite tell. The sound of the readings, the hymns, the prayers, all of it felt muted, as though muffled by the tension that filled the space. The absence of Mary, who simultaneously arranged masses for Edward's soul in the tower, hung over the ceremony like a shadow, an unspoken reminder of the fractured state of the kingdom. When the moment finally came to lower the coffin into the vault prepared for Edward, the air grew even heavier. The vault itself was small and arched, nestled near the tomb of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. a space never intended to house a monument or elaborate effigy. As the coffin descended, a faint clang echoed through the chamber, the sound of metal meeting stone, and several people involuntarily shivered as though the ground had momentarily chilled beneath them. The last Tudor boy king, barely 16 years old, was laid into a grave so narrow and shallow that his rest would never feel secure. It was a burial that felt more like concealment than honor. Once the stone slabs were moved into place, sealing Edward inside the cold darkness of the vault, the abbey shifted back into its rhythmic hum, though nothing felt truly natural. Attendants moved the candles. Clergy gathered their books. Nobles filed out slowly, their footsteps heavy with the knowledge that nothing in England would remain as it had been under the child who now lay beneath their feet. Outside, when the crowd waited to hear the bell, but even the bells sounded strained, their notes carrying the weight of uncertainty rather than the solemn certainty of closure. And in that sealed tomb, in the narrow space pressed between stone and darkness, Edward began the long stretch of his afterlife, a sleep that would be interrupted again and again, as if the world above refused to let him go, as if his story was not finished, as if history itself would one day reach back into that cramped vault and pull him into the light once more. The stone slabs that sealed Edward's coffin in the dim vault of Henry VII's chapel had scarcely settled before whispers began to drift through the corridors of the abbey. Whispers that suggested the burial had not eased the tension of the realm, but had merely pushed it beneath the surface, trapping it in the cold dark beside the boy king himself. The clergymen who had participated in the service returned to their chambers with faces drawn tight, as though the weight of the ritual clung to them more heavily than any other funeral they had officiated. Outside, the people dispersed in slow, murmuring waves, their footsteps echoing off the ancient stones, as if the building itself repeated their doubts back to them. No one felt cleansed. No one felt comforted. The burial had closed a coffin, but it had not closed a chapter. Mary's new reign began in the shadow of that uneasy burial, and the tension around her brother's death seemed to seep into the fabric of her court. In the early days of her rule, the corridors of Westminster and the Tower felt almost swollen with the pressure of conflicting loyalties. Catholic advisors pressed her to reclaim the old faith with sudden force, while Protestant figures moved quietly, warily, as though hunted. Edward's funeral, with its Protestant rites delivered by clergy who would soon face execution or imprisonment, lingered in the memory of everyone who had been present, making the moment feel less like a farewell and more like a symbolic battleground. The boy king's body might have been placed in the ground, but his legacy and the religious friction it carried remained very much above the earth. In the days that followed, the abbey staff approached the area of his burial with a sense of reverence mixed with discomfort. Some avoided passing over the vault altogether, choosing longer routes through the chapel rather than stepping across the stone beneath which Edward's coffin lay only a few feet below. Others found themselves glancing down at the floor with an uneasy curiosity, aware that the vault was so shallow that only a thin layer of stone separated them from the silent presence of a king. The knowledge that his grave lacked a proper monument added to the disquiet. Most Tudor monarchs were honored with elaborate memorials, carved effigies, and sculptural grandeur. Yet Edward rested hidden, unseen, pressed into a modest chamber overshadowed by the great tombs of those who ruled before him. The altar above his burial site had long been a structure of beauty and significance, a masterpiece carved by Pietro Torrigiano decades earlier. But for Edward, it became a strange kind of marker, one not meant for him, yet imposed upon him by circumstance. During Mary's reign, that altar would serve as the focal point of Catholic masses offered above the body of a boy who had spent his brief life striving to distance England from Catholic ritual. It was an irony no one dared to speak aloud, but one that hung in the shadows nevertheless, like a faint echo of unfinished conflict. The incense, the chants, the Latin murmured by priests, all of it drifted through the chapel, while Edward's coffin lay silently beneath, forming a strange, unintentional dialogue between the living and the dead. Yet time has a way of loosening even the tightest shadows, and in the decades that followed Mary's reign, The abbey continued its rhythm of ceremonies, coronations, weddings, and burials. Footsteps passed over Edward's vault each day, some belonging to those who knew his story, many belonging to those who did not. But despite the steady flow of time, the presence of the young king beneath the floor remained strangely potent, as though the vault held more than a body. Some said the air above the altar felt colder than the rest of the chapel. Others claimed that the candles nearest the spot occasionally flickered without a breeze, and a few whispered that the quiet in that corner of the room felt deeper than elsewhere, a sort of stillness that pressed against the senses. When the era of the Puritans arrived, that stillness shattered. The religious fury of the 17th century swept through churches and chapels like a storm, tearing down icons, smashing artwork, and ripping apart anything associated with Catholic ritual. The Torrigiano altar, with its intricate carvings and clear Catholic symbolism, became a prime target. Hammers struck marble, fragments scattered, and the once grand structure was left in ruins. In the chaos of that destruction, the vault containing Edward's coffin was disturbed, opened, examined not out of respect but out of curiosity, vandalism, or indifference. Bits of the broken altar were tossed into the tomb as if it were nothing more than a convenient pit. The lead coffin was damaged, the wooden outer shell torn, and whatever dignity had been granted to the young king during his burial was casually undone by hands that neither knew nor cared who lay inside. It is impossible to know exactly what the Puritans saw when they lifted the stone and peered inside. Did they flinch at the sight of the decaying cerecloth, or did they pry it aside with the same brutal detachment they had shown the altar above? Did they touch the coffin, push it, jostle it? Did they take something hair, cloth, bone as a morbid souvenir? As so many raiders of royal tombs have done across history, the answers are lost to time, but the evidence remained. The coffin was torn, the surrounding stone displaced, the burial disturbed. Edward's resting place, already without a monument, now bore the scars of theft, neglect, and destruction. And so, in the span of less than a century, the boy king had been buried, overshadowed, disrespected, and partially unearthed by zealots who cared nothing for his life or his death. No one restored the grave, no one cleansed the vault. The broken altar pieces remained inside, mingled with dust and debris. The coffin, misshapen and fragile, rested among stones that had been rearranged by hands long since turned to dust. Then came the passing years, the rising of new monarchs, the fall of old ones, the quiet settling of dust above Edward's tomb, and the faint sense that the boy had faded from memory, his burial a footnote beneath more dramatic events. But history is rarely as silent as it appears. The grave waited. The cracks in the floor remained, and deep beneath the surface, the coffin lingered in its damaged state, holding not only Edward's remains, but the weight of every upheaval that had rolled through England since his death. It was a fragile peace that settled there, a tentative calm that seemed almost respectful in its stillness, but it would not last. For even after centuries of remaining untouched, the vault's story was not done. The Abbey would one day reopen it under circumstances no one in Edward's lifetime could have imagined. And when that moment finally came, the world would peer inside once more, drawn by curiosity rather than destruction, yet still confronting a sight that revealed how little rest the young king had ever been granted. And so the vault waited in silence, its thin layer of stone separating the living world from the boy king below. A shallow grave holding not just a body, but the restless imprint of a history that refused to leave him buried. In the long quiet after the Puritans had done their damage, and the Abbey resumed its familiar rhythm of prayers, footsteps, and echoing voices, the vault beneath the floor seemed to settle back into stillness, yet the calm felt thin, like a thin sheet of ice stretched over deep, shifting water. Above, tourists of earlier centuries wandered through the chapel without understanding that their shoes scraped only inches above a bruised coffin and the remains of a king who had been pulled from peace more than once. Candles flickered, Incense curled upward in lazy spirals. Choirs sang notes that drifted through the ancient arches, and all the while the young king lay in the half-dark below. His resting place a narrow cavity patched with broken marble, disturbed soil, and the lingering scent of centuries-old damp. Time softened the memory of his suffering, but it never softened the reality of what rested beneath that stone. Generations passed, and the religious storms that had once shaken England mellowed into the steady hum of routine worship. The abbey grew accustomed to the flow of coronations and funerals, to tourists wandering its aisles, to scholars tracing fingers along weathered carvings, and to the steady pulse of history layered upon itself. Yet even in this calm, there were hints, whispers, disturbances, subtle shifts in the chapel's atmosphere that suggested the tomb below had never been completely forgotten. Some abbey staff claimed that when they cleaned near the altar late at night, they felt a strange pressure in the air, as though the chapel held its breath. Others said the floor above Edward's grave sometimes felt cooler than the rest of the stone even in summer, a faint chill radiating upward, like the quiet exhale of something trapped below. But such impressions were easily dismissed, swallowed by the busyness of daily life, until the 19th century dawned with its peculiar blend of fascination and obsession with the past. The Victorians, who loved unearthing secrets as much as erecting monuments, brought a new hunger for uncovering whatever lay hidden beneath old stones. They scraped dirt from battlefields, reopened ancient tombs, exhumed kings and queens in search of relics, and cataloged every discovery with scholarly precision. For them, disturbing the dead was not sacrilege, it was curiosity dressed in academic pride. And so it was only a matter of time before their attention drifted toward the quiet vault of Edward VI. The spark that ignited this new intrigue came not from Edward himself, but from another king, James I, whose burial had become a mystery that scholars were determined to solve. When it became clear that James's coffin was not resting with his wife Anne of Denmark, concern grew that his remains might have been stolen or misplaced during the upheavals of earlier centuries. The abbey authorized an investigation within the chapel of Henry VII, and the search for James inadvertently led to the threshold of Edward's tomb. The moment the plan was set into motion, it was as though the air inside the chapel thickened again, the weight of old secrets pushing upward from beneath the stone. When workers began lifting the slabs near the altar, they moved with a mixture of excitement and reverence, though the former grew quickly as they realized they were approaching an untouched chamber. Dust filled the air in soft clouds, drifting through the shafts of light that filtered through the stained glass. Tools scraped against ancient stone, their sounds echoing like slow, careful heartbeats. The abbey's dean, Arthur Penrhyn Stanley, watched closely, his eyes sharp with anticipation, fully aware that whatever lay beneath would offer a glimpse not only into the reign of a long-dead king, but into the turbulent history that followed. As the last slab was shifted aside and the narrow opening revealed itself, a hush descended over the room. Men leaned closer, lanterns held with steady hands, the golden flames flickering against their faces as they peered into the vault. The light touched the lead coffin, and a collective breath caught in the throats of all present. The coffin was warped, torn, and eaten by corrosion, its shape slumping inward like something that had endured violence or neglect long beyond what anyone expected. It did not rest neatly in the vault. It looked as though it had been dragged or jolted, its edges crushed against the surrounding stone. This was no untouched grave. Something unsettling had happened here, and the marks of it lingered like fingerprints on the past. Stanley stepped forward, his lantern casting a warm but unsteady glow across the interior of the vault. And what he saw deepened the mystery. Pieces of carved marble lay across the lower end of the coffin, fragments that did not belong inside a grave at all. They bore Renaissance-style carvings, patterns of Tudor roses and fleur-de-lis, details too fine to have been created for burial. These were remnants of Torrigiano's altar, the very structure destroyed during the Puritan desecrations. Their presence inside the tomb offered undeniable proof Edward's resting place had been opened, disturbed, and repurposed as a dumping ground for shattered holy art. The violence of that act seemed to hover thickly in the vault, as though the stones themselves remembered the hands that had ripped apart the altar and hurled fragments into the king's grave. Then came the discovery that would haunt Stanley's memory long after he left the chapel that day. Near the foot of the coffin, partially curled and unsoldered, lay a leaden plate. When lifted into the light, the plate revealed faint letters corroded, nearly erased by time, but with patient examination, with fingertips tracing grooves left by artisans centuries before. The inscription emerged: Edward VI, supreme head of the Church of England and Ireland under Christ. Dates spelled out, titles etched with quiet authority, a Protestant identity enshrined in metal and buried with a child king who had spent his life caught between his father's legacy and his own fragile body. Yet the most chilling sight came when the lantern was raised higher and the head of the coffin caught the light. The cerecloth around the skull had fallen away, and the hollow face of the boy king stared out from the shadows. No hair clung to the bone, no trace of flesh remained. The skull was clean, pale, almost luminous in the lamplight, as though time had stripped the last human softness from him and left only the stark reminder of mortality. Those present shifted uneasily, and one man muttered a prayer under his breath, his voice trembling despite the fact that he was not a superstitious man by nature. There was something deeply unsettling about seeing the exposed remains of a king whose life had been so brief and whose death had been so cruel. The vault was examined carefully, catalogued, and finally closed again with the solemnity of a ritual. A new slab was placed, treated, and marked. The altar above would later be rebuilt, incorporating fragments of the original structure that had been recovered from the grave. Yet even as the workmen sealed the tomb once more, there lingered an odd sense that the vault's story remained unfinished, that history had one more unsteady breath to exhale before it would settle into silence again. And above all, one truth hung heavily in the air. Edward's afterlife had never been peaceful. It had been as troubled, as contested, as unstable as his reign itself. A king disturbed by politics and life and disrupted by history and death, resting in a vault so shallow that centuries of footsteps had passed directly over him, unaware of the presence they were treading upon. And though the stone was sealed, though the lanterns dimmed, though the abbey resumed its steady pulse, nothing could truly erase the feeling that Edward, forgotten, uncovered, buried, unburied, examined, and sealed again, had never fully left the world above him. The vault was closed again, the stones pressed down with deliberate care, the dust brushed away, and the lanterns slowly extinguished one by one. Yet the air inside the chapel did not return to normal. Even after the last worker stepped back, even after the dean recorded his notes and the heavy silence reclaimed the room, there remained a strange tension, like the faint, lingering vibration of a bell long after its final strike. It was as if the tomb itself resisted the closing, as if centuries of disturbances had awakened a restlessness beneath the floor that could not be soothed by a single gesture of reverence. The abbey returned to its routines, but those who had looked into the vault carried something with them, a sensation that the dead king had been watching, not with malice, but with the quiet awareness of someone who had been alone far too long. In the days that followed, the dean reviewed his findings, cataloging each fragment, each inscription, each detail of the coffin's condition, and yet he found his thoughts drifting back again and again to the site of the skull, exposed and blanched by time, resting so close to the surface that it seemed almost to press upward, yearning for air. The uncovered bone, the fallen cerecloth, the warped coffin, all these details gnawed at him quietly. He tried to reassure himself that the Puritans had caused the damage, that centuries of shifting stone had loosened wrappings and warped metal. But the unease persisted. In the still hours of evening, when he walked the chapel alone, he sometimes paused near the altar, sensing something in the quiet, a presence not hostile but hollow, like the echo of a life cut short. Outside the abbey, news of the opening spread with the feverish curiosity of the Victorian age. Newspapers published articles describing the vault, the broken altar fragments, the unsoldered plate, and above all, the unsettling sight of the king's skull. Readers devoured every detail. Scholars debated whether the Puritans had desecrated the grave or whether earlier intrusions might have occurred. Letters flowed to the Abbey asking for clarifications, drawings, measurements, anything that might feed the public's insatiable appetite for uncovering the secrets of the dead. A strange mix of reverence and voyeurism gripped the country, and Edward, who had spent his life overshadowed by politics, became in death a new symbol, one of fragility, disturbance, and the uneasy blending of reverence with intrusion. The Abbey tried to quiet the speculation, but like many things born from curiosity, the interest only widened. People visited the chapel not simply to admire its beauty or honor the Tudor lineage, but to stand above the stone that concealed a young king's battered coffin. Some claimed they felt a chill when they stepped near the spot. Others said they sensed a shift in the air, a kind of soft pressure that brushed against them like a brief change in altitude. The human mind often creates meaning where none exists. Yet even the most rational visitors admitted the place felt heavier than the surrounding stones, as though the vault held not just physical remains, but the accumulated weight of every disruption Edward had endured. The modern altar, constructed above the tomb, incorporated fragments from Torrigiano's destroyed masterpiece, weaving the past into the present, though the symbolism did not escape those who understood the gravity of history. The ruined altar, torn apart by the Puritans centuries earlier, had been partially restored above the very tomb they had desecrated, a strange, indirect apology, a merging of destruction and restoration in a single quiet structure. It created a kind of symmetry, and yet even this gesture could not erase the years of violation that had marked the grave. The stone above Edward's vault remained smooth and unremarkable, but those who knew its secret could not help imagining the narrow chamber beneath. The coffin slumped against broken marble, the skull resting where time had placed it. There were moments, particularly at dusk, when the chapel took on a tone that reminded some of the watchful stillness found in old forests, as though the space held breath in its unseen corners. Light streamed through stained glass windows in long, colored shafts, scattering across the floor in soft gold and violet. When those colors reached the stones near Edward's tomb, they often dimmed faster than the surrounding light, as if the ground absorbed brightness more quickly there. Some dismissed it as a simple optical quirk, a trick of stone and shadow. Others wondered whether so many centuries of sorrow could leave a mark not physical, but atmospheric. Meanwhile, the dean and his assistants prepared a new slab for the coffin, engraving the necessary inscriptions and sealing the vault with fresh care. They worked methodically, yet the atmosphere felt different from any other restoration. History itself seemed to lean over their shoulders. When the new covering was lowered into place, a hush settled over the room once more, lasting longer than usual, stretching for a breath too long, as though even the chapel waited to see whether the tomb would accept this final gesture. Only when the last corner slid home, aligning flush with the surrounding stone, did the air release its tension and allow the workers to step back. The choice to place a plaque away from the true location of the tomb was practical, but it created a quiet dissonance between what visitors believed and what lay beneath the altar. For those who knew the truth, the separation felt strangely fitting. Edward's life had been marked by contradictions, a Protestant king buried beneath a Catholic altar, a young monarch overshadowed by the ambitions of others, a sovereign whose reign felt both significant and fragile. His death had been hidden, debated, delayed, and disturbed, and so it seemed almost poetic that his memorial was placed off-center, an echo rather than a marker. Even so, a subtle current of sadness woven through the chapel persisted, as though the boy still lingered in those unseen places between shadow and stone. At times, it seemed the vault had absorbed the emotional residue of all who had looked inside, the Puritans with their righteous fury, the Victorians with their eager fascination, the Dean with his quiet reverence. The tomb had been touched by too many hands, opened too many times, burdened with too many intentions. Edward had become more than a historical figure. He had become a symbol of disrupted rest. Yet amid all this, there was a strange kind of peace forming, delicate as morning frost. The Victorian Restoration, with its careful preservation of fragments and its renewed respect for the tomb, hinted at a softening of the centuries-long struggle between reverence and intrusion. The new slab lay firm and even, the altar stood whole once more, and the vault, at last, seemed ready to settle into a long, unbroken quiet. Still, for those who stood within the chapel at night, when the building emptied and the silence deepened, there was always the faintest sense that something old and watchful remained. Not a ghostly presence, but the lingering awareness of a story that had not fully faded. A reminder that history is never entirely buried, that the past breathes beneath us in ways we do not always see. And beneath the altar, beneath the polished stone, in the narrow vault sealed for the final time, Edward rested once more, not untouched by history but held within it, a boy king whose afterlife bore the weight of every era that stepped across his grave. The chapel settled into its restored quiet, the new slab lying smooth and pale above the narrow vault. Yet the story of Edward's troubled afterlife did not fade. Instead, it seeped deeper into the stones, into the drafts that whispered through the arches, into the flicker of candle flames that bent and straightened as though stirred by more than mere air. People walked across the polished floor with reverent steps, but if they paused for even a moment, they felt something subtle beneath the surface of faint tension, as if the earth below remembered the many times it had been pried open. Above ground, the abbey belonged to the living, but below, the vault still held the quiet ache of centuries, the echo of hands that had invaded its silence, the memory of eyes that had gazed inside, searching for answers the dead could not give. The Victorian scholars who had overseen the opening of the tomb returned to their notes, sketching and cataloging fragments of the altar, describing the coffin's condition in precise but almost mournful language, and debating the implications of what they had found. Letters circulated through historical societies, some marveling at the inscription on the lead plate, others dwelling on the eerie detail of the exposed skull. A few questioned the ethics of disturbing royal remains. Though such concerns were often overshadowed by the era's hunger for discovery, yet one sentiment rose repeatedly in their writings, a quiet astonishment at how close the young king had lain to the surface, how thin the separation was between the living world and the small, battered coffin that had endured so much. As the scholars moved on to other projects and the public's fascination dimmed, the abbey returned to its familiar rhythm. But the dean never shook the feeling that something about that vault remained unsettled. At night, when he walked through the chapel with only the soft glow of his lantern and the echo of his footsteps for company, he sometimes paused near the altar, not because he feared anything supernatural, but because he felt the weight of history pressing through the stone. He knew the story intimately, the boy king whose body had been left unburied for weeks, the religious battles that framed every decision about his funeral, the Puritan destruction that tore open his tomb, the Victorian curiosity that opened it again. He knew that beneath the smooth, quiet slab, the coffin lay crooked and dented, the skull resting bare, the fragments of Torrigiano's altar wedged against its foot like remnants of an old wound. Visitors came and went, often unaware that their footsteps passed directly over a king. Guides pointed toward grander tombs, Henry VII, with his elaborate gilded monument, Elizabeth of York serene beside him, the princesses and queens whose effigies stretched along the chapel's aisles. Edward, by contrast, remained hidden, without a monument, without a likeness carved in stone. Only a small plaque placed elsewhere in the chapel acknowledged his presence at all, a gesture of gratitude from Christ's Hospital rather than a royal tribute. Most visitors saw the plaque and believed they stood above the young king. Only a few knew the truth that he lay several feet away, beneath the altar, tucked into a vault so small no second coffin would ever fit beside him. Yet perhaps because of this anonymity, the chapel around the vault seemed to hum with a slightly different energy than the rest of the abbey. The air felt heavier, almost contemplative, as though the space itself had absorbed centuries of layered meaning. Those who cleaned the area spoke quietly of noticing slight temperature shifts, as though the stone cooled faster there when the chapel emptied at night. Candle wicks burned unevenly near the altar, their flames leaning sideways before righting themselves. To the rational mind, these were minor things, coincidences of architecture and airflow. And yet, for those who lingered long enough, the impression became unmistakable. Something about the place invited reflection, a kind of silent companionship with a life unfinished. Sometimes choir practice filled the chapel with sound, voices rising and falling in harmonies that wrapped around the stone arches. When the music reached the altar, the acoustics created a subtle resonance that carried deep into the floor, as if the vault below absorbed the sound and held it for a moment before releasing it back into the air. Even without knowing Edward's story, listeners sometimes described a sense of sorrow woven through the acoustics, a bittersweet undertone that made the music feel older than the notes being sung. The children in the choir felt it most strongly. They often avoided standing too close to the altar, instinct guiding them away from something they couldn't articulate. Season after season passed, and the abbey saw the usual tides of tourists, historians, worshippers, and passers-by, all moving through the chapel with varying degrees of reverence and curiosity. Some paused near the altar without knowing why, drawn by the quiet gravity of the space. Others hurried by, oblivious to the story beneath their steps. But every once in a while, someone with a keen eye would glance at the ground, notice the slight difference in the stone's color, the faint outline of the slab that covered the vault, and feel a shiver of recognition, the sense that beneath their feet lay unfinished history, a story woven into the very ground. The dean, now older and slower in his movements, often found himself standing near the altar late in the evening, watching the last of the daylight fade through the stained glass and fill the chapel with soft, diffused colors. In those moments, he would recall the opening of the vault, the stillness of the coffin, the glint of the bare skull in the lantern light. He wondered whether Edward, in life so burdened by expectation and in death so battered by time, had ever sensed how turbulent his rest would be. He wondered whether the boy had felt alone during those long weeks of illness, whether he had known how fiercely the country would argue over the rituals that would lay him to rest, whether he would have understood how little of him would remain unviolated centuries later. But perhaps most of all, the dean wondered whether Edward's quiet vault beneath the altar had finally become what it was meant to be, a place of rest. The new slab was firm, the altar rebuilt, the plaque in place, the air settled. No one planned to open the tomb again. No scholars petitioned for further examinations. The grave, at long last, had been allowed to close its story. And yet, as he looked down at the stone, the dean acknowledged a truth that lingered in his mind with the soft insistence of a distant echo. No life is brief. No death is fraught. No burial as disrupted as Edward's could ever truly be sealed. The vault held not only the remains of a king, but the layered imprint of everything that had happened since his dying breath. It held the weight of politics, the violence of religious fervor, the curiosity of future centuries, the quiet ache of a childhood cut short. It held a story too jagged to be smoothed away completely. Still, whether restless or finally at peace, the boy king lay there beneath the altar, wrapped in darkness and silence, resting in a place where generations would pass overhead unaware, leaving only the stone and the memory of his troubled afterlife to keep vigil in the quiet heart of the abbey. The years that followed the Victorian rediscovery of Edward's tomb moved like a long, slow tide, steady and unhurried, washing layer after layer of ordinary time across the chapel floor, as if attempting to smooth the jaggedness of everything that had happened beneath the stones. Yet even as the world outside the abbey changed, as generations rose and fell, as wars raged in quiet, decades passed, the narrow vault beneath the altar remained a fixed point, an unmoving anchor in the river of history. It waited in darkness, undisturbed, but never forgotten, not truly. Not by those who understood how the past refuses to stay silent, no matter how tightly the future presses down upon it. And above the stone, Life continued with quiet regularity, unaware of the king lying so close to the surface, watching through time. The abbey itself entered the modern era with a kind of resigned grace, its ancient stones adapting to electricity, new lighting, changing rituals, and the constant flow of visitors who arrived not only with reverence, but with cameras, maps, and the restless curiosity of travelers who wanted to see everything, yet understand little. They walked past the altar with the quick steps of people following a schedule. They admired the gilded tombs of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, marveling at their intricate carvings and elaborate effigies, unaware that just a few feet away lay a king whose resting place had never been granted the same dignity, whose burial had always been shaped more by conflict than by ceremony. The plaque set into the floor a short distance from the vault misdirected them, offering a polite but misleading acknowledgement placed by an institution grateful for Edward's founding generosity, not by a monarch seeking to preserve family legacy. But while the visitors moved quickly, the abbey staff moved differently. Those who worked in the chapel daily could sense the subtle nuances of the space, the way sound traveled, the way drafts whispered, the way candles guttered when no door had opened. And among them, there was quiet consensus that the area around the altar held a different kind of stillness. It was not eerie, nor threatening, nor suggestive of anything supernatural. Rather, it felt attentive, as though the air itself held memory. Even the slightest footsteps across the slab seemed to vibrate deeper than the rest of the floor, as if the stone absorbed and remembered every shift of weight, every movement of those who passed overhead. Some of the vergers would pause there briefly during their rounds, not in fear, but in a small instinctive gesture of acknowledgement, as though offering a moment of companionship to a child who had been alone too often in life and in death. During the quietest hours, often at dawn when the first thin strands of sunlight slid through the stained glass windows and painted the chapel in muted hues, the stone above the vault seemed to hold its own kind of breath. The colors that spilled across the floor met the slab with a unique softness, diffusing into it in a way that made the surface appear almost warmer, though touch always revealed the coolness of centuries-old stone. It was a simple trick of light, perhaps, but one that caught the attention of those who witnessed it. The interplay of color and shadow around the altar hinted at the delicate balance between presence and absence, between what was visible and what lay hidden just beneath the surface. As decades passed, scholars continued to write about Edward, though their tone softened over time, shifting from the dry factuality of earlier centuries to something more reflective, almost mournful. They debated his legacy, his zeal for Protestant reform, his intelligence, the precocious seriousness of his writings, but increasingly they devoted attention to his suffering, to the loneliness of his illness, to the sense that he had been a boy asked to carry burdens far too heavy for his age. They wrote about his burial as a symbol of a country torn between two faiths, and about the repeated disturbances of his corpse as a kind of historical echo, a reminder of the instability that marked the Tudor era. And though not all historians believed in the emotional resonance of places, many acknowledged that Edward's tomb, hidden and frequently overlooked, was one of the most unusual royal resting places in England. Meanwhile, the abbey grew busier. More visitors arrived each year, their footsteps layering over the stone like sediment, creating an ever-thickening tapestry of movement above the vault. Families wandered through the chapel, their voices echoing softly before falling away into reverent whispers. Students arrived with notebooks, scribbling facts that would soon fade from memory. Tourists paused to take photographs, unaware that the stone capturing their reflection concealed a boy king whose afterlife had been so turbulent. And yet, every now and then, someone paused near the altar with a strange, inexplicable pull, a sense that there was more beneath their feet than the polished floor suggested. They might not have known Edward's name or his story, but the air around the altar carried an undeniable gravity that invited contemplation. When night once again claimed the abbey, the lingering warmth of the day faded and cool drafts curled through the chapel's arches. The electric lights dimmed, leaving the space in a hushed semi-darkness that felt older than any decade. older than any century. It was during these hours, the quiet hours, the listening hours, that the presence of the vault felt strongest. Not in an ominous way, but in a way that suggested the chapel understood the weight of its history. The stone above the vault held the faint echo of rituals past, of candles burned, of prayers whispered above the boy who never received the monumental tomb others deemed essential. And within the vault, Edward's coffin remained untouched now for generations. The lid had not been disturbed since the Victorian Restoration. The fragments of Torrigiano's altar remained where the workers had left them. The skull, once exposed to candlelight during the investigation, now lay again in total darkness. The cerecloth, eaten away by time, clung only in shreds. But though the vault was still, though no human hand had reached inside for more than a century, the story of the boy king continued to pulse through the abbey in quiet, persistent waves. Perhaps this was because Edward had become less a historical figure and more a symbol, a reminder of the fragility of youth, of the violence of upheaval, of the way history often demands too much from those who carry the least blame. His hidden tomb embodied that theme. It was small, unadorned, pressed into a corner of grandeur, easy to overlook yet impossible to erase. It held the tension of a life caught between future and past, between hope and illness, between devotion and disturbance. The abbey would go on to witness countless ceremonies crowning new monarchs, farewelling old ones, honoring soldiers, blessing marriages, mourning tragedies. Yet through all of this, Edward's tomb remained constant, a quiet presence beneath the stone, a reminder that some stories linger long after the world has moved on. And though his vault was sealed, though time grew thicker above it, there persisted a sense that Edward still occupied a space in the living history of the abbey, not loudly, not tragically, but with the gentle, unwavering remembrance of a life interrupted and an afterlife marked by both intrusion and reluctant reverence. In that quiet, resting beneath the altar, where countless feet passed each day, the boy king remained not forgotten, not erased, but settled into the kind of stillness that comes only after centuries of unrest, a stillness that was not quite peace, but close enough to resemble it, like the last soft note of a hymn fading into the vaulted air of the chapel he had never chosen, yet would forever inhabit. Light returned each morning to the chapel, much as it had for centuries, sliding through stained glass windows in patient strips of color, brushing across carved stone kings and queens who had long since surrendered their stories to the stillness of history. Yet when it reached the altar beneath which Edward lay, it always seemed to soften and settle in a different way, as though the place absorbed the brightness rather than simply reflecting it. By then, the world outside the abbey had changed beyond anything the boy king could have imagined. With new monarchs crowned, empires rising and falling, cities swelling with noise and machines in ceaseless movement. But deep under the polished floor, his narrow vault remained exactly as it had been left, untouched, unspeaking. A quiet pocket of the 16th century sealed inside the modern heart of London. The presence of his tomb, unseen by most, had become a silent constant, not dramatic, not haunting, simply there, woven into the life of the abbey with the subtle permanence of a knot tied deep within a tapestry. Those who worked in the chapel grew used to its rhythms, the soft scuff of shoes on stone, the sibilance of hushed voices drifting between the pews, the layered echoes that rose and fell with the day's foot traffic. Yet if any of them lingered near the altar when the building was nearly empty, they felt a subtle shift, a gentle weight in the air that hinted at something older than habit. It was not fear, nor superstition, but a quiet awareness that beneath the floor rested a king who had never enjoyed the certainty of peace. Edward's story, preserved now in books and plaques and whispered recollections, had become part of the abbey's identity, a counterpoint to the grand monuments and lavish tombs that surrounded him. The vault's lack of ornament, its secrecy, its scars from centuries of disturbance, all these things made the space uniquely human amid the marble grandeur that framed it. There were moments in the modern era that briefly pressed Edward's memory back to the surface anniversaries of his birth or death, exhibitions of Tudor history, the occasional scholar who requested permission to examine documents about his funeral, but each spark of renewed interest faded swiftly, replaced by whatever event or headline drew the world's attention next. And so his vault slipped in and out of public awareness, sometimes mentioned in a footnote, sometimes shown in a grainy photograph, sometimes spoken of by a tour guide as an intriguing detail. Yet even as his name drifted in and out of conversation, the tomb itself remained still, its stone seal holding firm against anything that might disrupt it. Eventually, the Abbey made it clear that no further openings would be considered. The Victorian intrusion had been the last. The vault would remain closed indefinitely. But for all that finality, the sense of Edward's presence endured in subtle ways. Visitors who stopped before the altar, without knowing why, often described feeling unexpectedly contemplative, as though something about the space invited a quieting of the mind. Some said they felt as though they were standing on the edge of a story rather than merely in a room. A few spoke of faint chills, the kind that rise not from fear, but from a sudden awareness of depth, as though the place whispered of things that had once mattered greatly and still echoed faintly in the air. History does not vanish simply because the living forget. It folds itself into the places where it happened and lingers there, soft but unbroken. And the chapel above Edward's tomb felt like one of those places, a chamber attuned to the faint pulse of a boy who had carried the weight of a kingdom before he was old enough to understand his own fragility. The Abbey's vergers, those who unlocked the chapel at dawn and extinguished its lights at night, sometimes found themselves speaking softly when near the altar, lowering their voices not by necessity, but by instinct. They knew the story well, the slow death, the delayed burial, the contested rituals, the desecrations, the Victorian rediscovery, and in that knowledge they felt a certain responsibility, a small but sincere desire to tread respectfully across the stone beneath which a child had endured century after century of unrest. They did not fear the vault, nor did they romanticize it. They simply understood that rest was something Edward had been denied in life and had too often been denied in death. The least they could do was move gently above him, and still the world shifted beyond the chapel walls. Wars burned across continents. New monarchs were crowned in elaborate ceremonies just steps away. The Abbey filled with mourners and celebrants, prayers and music, silence and applause. And through it all, the tomb remained unchanged. Modern lighting traced new angles across the floor, but the slab above the vault stayed cool and still, indifferent to the glow. Waves of tourists carrying smartphones and guidebooks streamed across the aisles with eyes fixed on distant points, rarely glancing down at the stone that held a king. And the older the Abbey became, the more Edward's resting place felt like a quiet contradiction, a secret in plain sight. A royal tomb hiding beneath the feet of strangers who did not know they were passing above a child who had once been the hope of England. There were rare moments, however, when someone who knew the story would pause intentionally beside the altar. Not out of superstition, but out of empathy. Teachers bringing students, historians sharing a quiet detail, parents explaining the fragility of kingship to curious children. These small acts created threads of remembrance that bound Edward's story to each new generation. Some visitors left flowers near the plaque even after learning it did not mark the exact location of the tomb, as though the gesture mattered more than the accuracy, as though the act of remembering was itself a way of giving peace. The Abbey staff never removed such offerings in haste. They allowed them to rest a while, small tokens of recognition for a boy who had received far fewer honors than the monarchs who surrounded him. Night remained the time when the presence of the vault felt most distinct. After the last visitors had been ushered out and the great wooden doors closed for the evening, the chapel embraced a stillness that seemed almost reverent. The absence of footsteps amplified the softness of the stone. The faint hum of distant city noise softened to a dull murmur, and the only movement came from shadows drifting across the walls as clouds passed slowly before the moon. In that quiet, it was possible to imagine the centuries layered atop one another like sedimentary rock, each era leaving its trace, each disturbance echoing faintly through the vault. It was not haunting, but humbling, a reminder of how time moves both swiftly and slowly, carrying lives away even as it preserves their outlines in the places they leave behind. And deep beneath the polished stone, wrapped in layers of darkness and silence, Edward lay as he had for so many generations. His coffin remained tilted where time and intrusion had left it, the metal dented and warped from centuries of neglect, the fragments of the ruined altar resting like ancient companions at its foot. His skull, once exposed to lantern light during the Victorian opening, lay again in darkness, freed at last from the intrusive gaze of scholars. No further hands would touch the vault. No tools would pry open its stones. No curious eyes would disturb his rest. Whatever peace Edward now possessed was imperfect, forged from a lifetime and afterlife of turmoil, but it was peace nonetheless, the quiet that follows long suffering, the stillness that finally settles after centuries of being pulled back into the world. Above him, the Abbey continued its endless rhythm, living centuries unfolding over the shallow grave of a king whose reign had barely begun. Edward no longer had to watch. He merely remained, part of the foundation, part of the story, part of the breath of the chapel itself. And though his tomb lay hidden from sight, known only to those who sought it, the memory of his troubled life and restless afterlife endured not loudly, not grandly, but with the soft persistence of a candle that refuses to go out, its flames small yet steady in the vast quiet of Westminster Abbey.